Welcome to Diary of Owen. The detail that stayed with me in this story was a single sheet of ivory paper moving slowly across a glass table. It had been printed with 42 names, each one assigned to a seat at an engagement party that never happened. By the end of the afternoon, the man telling this story had turned the page over and used the blank side to write down 4 facts. Not accusations, not questions, just 4 things he knew to be true. There was also a ring in a walnut box, a blue dress waiting inside a garment bag, and several hundred tiny lights suspended above an empty dance floor. But it was that sheet of paper and the calm handwriting on the back of it that remained with me. You're watching Diary of Owen. Let's go back to the morning before the guests were supposed to arrive. At 7:14 on Saturday morning, the printer in our study began making the dry, mechanical clicking sound it made whenever 2 sheets entered the rollers at once. I was standing in the kitchen with one hand around a mug of coffee and the other resting on the edge of the counter. The apartment was quiet enough that I could hear the paper straighten itself inside the machine. Mara was in the shower. The engagement party was scheduled to begin at 6:30 that evening at the Glass House on Alder Quay. We had 42 guests coming, including her parents, my sister, 3 people who had flown in from other cities, and an uncle of mine who had not attended a family celebration in nearly 9 years. The printer was producing the final seating plan. I waited for the clicking to stop, then walked down the hallway. Our study was the smallest room in the apartment, barely wide enough for 2 desks, and the low walnut cabinet where Mara stored wrapping paper, passport photographs, and the collection of expensive notebooks she bought but rarely wrote in. Morning light came through the slatted blinds and narrow white bars. The printer tray held 7 sheets. The first 6 were the seating plan. The 7th was a furnished residential sublease agreement. I lifted it without thinking much about it. Mara worked in brand partnerships for a regional arts foundation, and documents often appeared in our printer queue at strange hours. She sometimes reviewed sponsorship contracts from home. I assumed this was related to an artist or a visiting director. Then I saw her name, Mara Keswick. The property was Unit 4C at 19 Lantern Street in Port Meridian, a coastal city almost 800 miles away. The lease began on Monday. It ran for 6 months. The rent had already been paid in full. I read those details twice because the first time they felt like separate pieces of information that had not yet agreed to belong to the same sentence. The printer released one final page. It was the signature sheet. Mara had signed it 11 days earlier. There was another signature beneath hers. Julian Merrick. I knew the name. Everyone has certain names stored in the mind without deciding to keep them. A childhood teacher. A doctor who once delivered bad news. The person who called at an unusual hour. Julian's name belonged to that category. He had worked with Mara at her previous company. For almost 2 years, he had appeared in stories with a frequency that seemed ordinary until it suddenly stopped. He was clever. He was restless. He changed jobs often and cities even more often. Once, during the 2nd year Mara and I were together, he had called her from an airport at 2 o'clock in the morning because he had missed a flight and wanted someone to talk to. Mara had told me later that Julian confused attention with intimacy. I remembered the wording because it had sounded precise. I placed the lease on my desk. The shower pipes groaned inside the wall. A few seconds later, the water stopped. There are moments when the body reacts before thought becomes useful. My hands went cold. The skin along my arms tightened. For perhaps 10 seconds, I felt my heartbeat in my throat rather than my chest. Then the part of me shaped by 16 years of inspecting elevators took over. My job was not repairing elevators. I inspected them after repairs, during property transfers, following unusual shutdowns, and whenever an owner suspected that a maintenance report did not match the actual condition of the equipment. Elevators are built around concealed systems. Most passengers see polished doors, illuminated buttons, and a number changing above their heads. They do not see the traction cables, the brake assembly, the governor, or the steel frame carrying the load. When something appears wrong, an inspector does not begin by imagining the worst possible failure. He secures the system, records the visible evidence, and establishes what is known. I turned the lease over. On the blank side, I wrote the time. 7:19 a.m. Below that, I wrote 3 facts. The lease began Monday. Mara had signed 11 days ago. Julian Merrick had signed with her. I did not write what I feared those facts meant. Mara came into the hallway 6 minutes later wearing a white robe and rubbing a towel through her hair. She had slept badly. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes and a small red mark on her left cheek from the seam of the pillowcase. She asked whether the printer had worked. I said it had. She looked past me toward the study. For an instant, her expression changed. It was not guilt exactly. It was recognition. A person seeing that a door they believed closed had been left open. Then she smiled and asked whether the seating plan looked right. I said I had not checked every name yet. She walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. She spoke about the florist arriving at 4, her father's train being delayed by 20 minutes, and whether we should move my uncle farther from the speakers because of his hearing aid. I watched her take almond milk from the refrigerator and shake the carton twice. Mara always shook it 3 times. We had been together for 5 years and 3 months. That sounds like the kind of measurement a person invents after a relationship ends, but I knew the duration because our first date had taken place on March 12th, and Mara celebrated the 12th of every month for the first year. She would leave a pastry beside my keys or send me a photograph from wherever she happened to be at noon. She said ordinary anniversaries were too far apart. We met inside a stalled elevator. It was not one I had inspected. That distinction mattered to me at the time. The elevator was in the old Renford Hotel, a narrow brick building in the eastern part of Harrowfield. Mara was there for a charity exhibition. I was meeting a building manager about a modernization proposal. The elevator stopped between the 4th and 5th floors. There were 6 of us inside. One man repeatedly pressed the alarm button, though the first press had already connected us to the control desk. A woman began breathing too quickly. Someone's child was crying. Mara sat on the floor beside the woman and asked her to count the brass screws around the control panel. There were 14. By the time they reached 10, the woman's breathing had slowed. I explained that the car had not fallen, that the brake had engaged, and that the sensation of being suspended was uncomfortable, but not inherently dangerous. Mara looked up at me and asked whether I always sounded that calm. I told her only when I was trapped in a steel box with strangers. The doors opened 23 minutes later. She found me in the hotel lobby after the exhibition and asked whether I wanted coffee. We stayed until the cafe staff stacked chairs around us. For years afterward, she would tell people that she had fallen in love with me because I made a stalled elevator seem boring. The truth was that I fell in love with her first. It happened while she was counting screws with a frightened stranger. Mara brought movement into my life. She liked last-minute reservations, afternoon trains, and shops that sold objects with no obvious purpose. I liked plans made 3 weeks in advance and drawers containing only what their labels promised. We were different without being incompatible. At least, that was what I had believed. She taught me to leave restaurants without ordering dessert if the evening felt complete. I taught her to keep copies of important documents in a folder that could be reached without standing on a chair. When her mother needed surgery, I drove Mara to Belmere Hospital at 4:40 in the morning and sat with her for 14 hours beneath a television showing a cooking program with the sound turned off. When my father died, she stayed in my apartment for 3 weeks. She answered calls I could not answer and placed food in front of me without asking whether I was hungry. She knew I disliked sympathy delivered as performance. She never once told me to be strong. That tenderness was real. Its existence did not become false because of what I found in the printer. That was what made the paper difficult to hold. I had proposed 8 months earlier at the observation platform of a decommissioned water tower outside North Bellwether. There had been no photographer hiding nearby and no family waiting behind a wall. Mara had once told me that public proposals felt like questions asked with the answer already demanded. So I asked her alone. She cried before I had finished speaking. The ring was a pale oval sapphire surrounded by 12 small diamonds. She chose sapphires over clear stones because she said they looked as though they remembered the night. The engagement party had been her idea. Her father had been recovering from another operation when we became engaged, and several members of her family could not travel. Mara wanted one evening where everyone could be in the same room. She found the glass house herself. It stood on the roof of a converted warehouse at 18 Alder Quay. The walls and ceiling were made almost entirely of glass, with steel beams painted cream and climbing vines trained along copper wires. At night, the harbor lights appeared to float beyond the windows. We had visited it 4 times before signing the contract. Mara stood in the center of the empty room during the first visit and turned slowly beneath the hanging lights. She said she wanted people to remember us there. At 8:02 that Saturday morning, she kissed my cheek and left for a hair appointment. She wore black leggings, white shoes, and the gray sweatshirt she had taken from my drawer 3 years earlier. The engagement ring was on her finger. She told me she would meet me at the venue at 4:15. I watched her walk down the corridor through the small security monitor beside the door. She did not look back. I returned to the study. The sensible thing might have been to call her immediately. I considered it. My hand was already around my phone. But calling would have turned 3 facts into a conversation before I knew whether I understood them. I did not want denial to become the first explanation I heard. I did not want anger to decide the order in which I asked questions. The laptop on Mara's desk was open. The previous evening, she had asked me to download the slideshow for the party because the venue required it on a physical drive. The screen had gone dark but had not locked. When I touched the trackpad, a folder appeared. Inside were photographs arranged by year. A message notification appeared in the corner of the screen. It came from Julian. The visible line read that he had checked in for both seats and would see her Monday morning. I sat down. My first instinct was to close the notification. My second was to pretend I had not seen the lease. People often speak of betrayal as though it creates immediate clarity. For me, it created an almost physical desire to return to ignorance. I wanted the previous hour back. I wanted to be concerned about whether my uncle's table was too close to the speakers. The message disappeared before I touched it. The conversation window remained open in the background. I could see enough without scrolling. Julian had written the previous night that 6 months was a long time to spend together if Mara was still uncertain. Mara had replied that uncertainty was the point. She needed to know who she was when she was not somebody's fiancée. Julian asked whether she had told me. Mara said she would tell me after the party. She could not cancel before then. Her parents had invited everyone. The deposits had been paid. People had traveled. She wanted one final evening where nobody was disappointed in her. Julian replied that I would probably try to convince her to stay. Mara said that was what frightened her. She wrote that I was patient enough to make leaving feel unreasonable. The next line took me longer to understand. She said she still loved me, but she wanted the freedom to find out whether loving me was the same as choosing me. Julian answered that once the party was finished, she would be free. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I closed the laptop. The room had warmed in the morning sun. Light passed between the blinds and formed bright lines across the floor, the printer, and the lease on my desk. I turned the seating plan over again. Below the first 3 facts, I added a 4th. She planned to tell me after the engagement party. I did not copy the messages. I did not photograph the screen. I did not search for more. There was enough. By 9:10, I had showered and dressed for work. I had not intended to work that Saturday. I had taken the day off almost 6 weeks earlier. But at 8:47, my supervisor called about an elevator at Venick Tower that had stopped abruptly during a test run. The building was still unoccupied. No one had been injured. The maintenance company wanted an independent inspection before allowing the cars back into service on Monday. I agreed to go. Perhaps I needed the work. Perhaps I needed to stand in front of something broken whose parts could be named. I placed the lease inside a plain document folder and carried it with me. Venick Tower stood 31 stories above the north end of Harrowfield, where old printing factories had been replaced by glass offices and expensive cafes. Rain had begun by the time I reached it at 9:38. The drops struck the temporary metal awning over the entrance with a sharp, uneven rhythm. A technician named Bram Holt met me in the lobby. He was 58, careful, and incapable of giving a short answer when a complete one was available. I trusted him for that reason. The elevator had stopped between the 26th and 27th floors during a no-load test. The safety circuit had opened. The brake had engaged normally. The building's monitoring system showed no overspeed event. We rode the service elevator to the machine room. The room was cold enough that my fingertips stiffened against the handrail. The drive motor occupied the center platform. Control cabinets lined the wall, each marked with yellow labels and inspection dates. Bram began explaining what his team had checked. I listened. I asked for the event log. At 6:42 the previous evening, a door zone sensor on the 27th floor had reported an intermittent fault. The system had stopped the elevator because it could no longer verify the position of the car with sufficient accuracy. The fault was small. The response was not. That was how safe systems worked. They did not wait for a small uncertainty to become a catastrophe. They interrupted normal operation while the uncertainty could still be examined. I stood at the control cabinet with the log in my hand. For the first time that morning, I understood what I was going to do. Not how I felt, not what the next 6 months would look like, only what I had to do before 6:30. I completed the inspection. The sensor cable had been pinched behind a mounting bracket during recent work. Its insulation was damaged, causing an intermittent loss of signal. We isolated the elevator until the cable could be replaced. At 11:16, I signed the temporary shutdown notice. Bram asked whether I was heading to the engagement party afterward. He knew about it because I had declined another inspection the week before and mentioned the event. I said the plans had changed. He studied my face for a moment. He was old enough not to demand an explanation. He said he was sorry. I thanked him. In the parking garage, I sat inside my car with the engine off. The folder containing the lease rested on the passenger seat. Beside it was the walnut ring box I had taken from the back of our bedroom drawer before leaving home. Mara wore the ring, but the box had remained there since the proposal. I called the glass house. The venue coordinator, Celine Arbor, answered on the third ring. I had spoken to her at least 20 times during the previous 2 months. I asked whether she was already at the venue. She said she would arrive at 1. I told her the engagement party would not be taking place. There was a pause. She asked whether I wanted to reschedule. I said no. She asked whether there had been an emergency. I said there had been a change in our relationship and that I would meet her at the venue at 3 to settle the remaining invoices. Celine lowered her voice. She said the kitchen had already begun preparing the food and the flowers were due at 4. I told her I understood. We would pay every contracted charge. She asked what she should tell the staff. I said only that the event had been canceled. I did not call the guests yet. Before informing 42 people that an engagement had ended, I believed the other person in the engagement deserved to hear it directly. I drove to a small cafe called Copper Finch, 3 streets from the glass house. It was nearly empty. I ordered tea I did not drink and took a table against the back wall. At 11:48, Mara sent me a photograph from the salon. Her hair had been pinned into a loose arrangement at the back of her head. She was smiling. A pale blue cloth covered her shoulders. She asked whether I liked it. I stared at the photograph for almost a minute. I wrote that it looked beautiful. That was true. She replied with a heart. I placed the phone face down. At noon, I called my sister Nina. She was supposed to arrive at the venue early to help arrange the guest book and place cards. She answered while driving and immediately began telling me that traffic near Eastbridge was slow. I asked her to pull over. She stopped at a petrol station 6 minutes later and called back. I told her the engagement was over and the party had been canceled. She asked what happened. I said Mara had made plans to leave on Monday and spend 6 months in Port Meridian with someone else. She had intended to tell me after the party. Nina became silent. I could hear the indicator clicking in her car. She asked whether I was certain. I said I was. She asked where I was. I told her. She said she would come immediately. I asked her not to. There are kinds of support that protect a person, and kinds that prevent him from discovering whether he can remain upright on his own. At that moment, I needed the second discovery. I asked Nina to call our uncle and the 3 relatives who were traveling with him. I would contact everyone else after speaking with Mara. Nina asked what I wanted her to tell them. I said the truth without the details. The event was canceled. The engagement had ended. We needed privacy, she said. Mara did not deserve privacy. I said I was not protecting only Mara. Nina exhaled slowly. Then she said she understood. At 1:07, Mara called. Her hair appointment had finished early. She was going to have lunch with her mother and wanted to know whether I needed anything. For half a second, I almost asked her to come to the cafe. Instead, I said I needed her at the glass house at 3:45. She reminded me that we had agreed on 4:15. I said there was a problem with the seating arrangements. That was not entirely false. She said she would try. I told her it was important. Something in my voice reached her. She stopped speaking for a moment, then said she would be there. At 1:30, I began drafting the message to our guests. The first version was too long. The second tried to answer questions no one had asked yet. The third mentioned that the decision was mutual. I deleted that because it was untrue. The fourth blamed no one. Mara and I have ended our engagement, so tonight's celebration will not take place. I am sorry for the short notice, and for the disruption to those who traveled. Please respect our privacy. I read it 6 times. Then I saved it, without sending. At 2:08, I received an email from the airline carrying Mara and Julian to Port Meridian. It had been sent to my address because Mara still used our shared travel account. The subject line invited her to review the itinerary. 2 passengers, Monday, 6:20 a.m., one-way tickets. The seats were beside each other. I did not open the email. I added the time to the back of the seating plan, beneath the 4 facts already there. Then I drew a line across the page. Everything above the line belonged to the question of whether the engagement still existed. It did not. Everything below the line would belong to logistics. That distinction steadied me. At 3, I met Celine at the glass house. The room looked almost ready. Long tables stood beneath the suspended lights. Ivory linens had been pressed and laid across them. The chairs were arranged in groups of 6. Glass candle holders waited in neat rows beside boxes of unused candles. Beyond the windows, the harbor was gray beneath the rain. Celine wore a black suit and white trainers. She had a clipboard under one arm. She asked whether I wanted coffee. I declined. We sat at a small glass table near the entrance. I explained that the engagement had ended and that no guests would be admitted. She handed me a statement of charges. The total was more than I expected, but less than I feared. Food already prepared could not be refunded. Staff had been scheduled. The florist had completed the arrangements. I paid the balance from my personal account. Mara and I had a joint account for household expenses, but I did not want her to discover what was happening through a banking notification. Celine asked what should be done with the food. I told her to distribute it among the staff and donate whatever the kitchen could safely package. The flowers could be delivered to 2 residential care homes that Celine worked with during other events. She wrote down the instruction. There was no triumph in canceling the party. No sense of reclaiming control. There was only a room prepared to hold a future that no longer existed. At 3:32, the florist arrived. 4 people began carrying arrangements through the service entrance. White ranunculus, blue delphiniums, and branches of eucalyptus filled tall ceramic vessels. Mara had chosen them because the colors matched the sapphire in her ring. I looked away. Celine asked whether I wanted the staff to clear the room before Mara arrived. I said no. The room was part of what had happened. It did not need to be hidden. At 3:51, Mara stepped out of the elevator. She was 14 minutes earlier than expected. She wore the blue dress. The fabric was darker than the flowers and lighter than the evening sky beyond the glass. The sleeves ended at her wrists. Her hair was pinned behind her head, with 2 loose strands beside her face. The ring remained on her left hand. She stopped near the entrance when she saw the empty room. The staff had moved into the kitchen. Celine stood near the service corridor, far enough away that she could not hear us. Mara asked where everyone was. I told her the event had been canceled. She stared at me. Then she looked at the tables, perhaps expecting guests to emerge from behind them. She asked why. I placed the document folder on the glass table. The lease was inside. Mara did not touch it. Her eyes moved from the folder to my face. She said my name softly. I told her I knew about Port Meridian. For several seconds, she seemed unable to decide whether to deny the city, the lease, or the person whose name appeared beneath hers. She asked how I found it. I said it came through the printer with the seating plan. Her shoulders lowered. She sat down. I remained standing until she looked at the chair opposite her. Then I sat too. The rain had become heavier. Water moved down the glass walls in separate trails, distorting the harbor cranes outside. Mara said she could explain. I told her I would listen. She looked toward the kitchen entrance. I said no one was close enough to hear. She pressed her hands together on the table. The sapphire ring touched the glass with a small, hard sound. She began by saying that nothing physical had happened with Julian. I said I had not asked. She said she needed me to understand that. I told her I understood what she was saying. She explained that Julian had contacted her 4 months earlier. He had accepted a position in Port Meridian and needed help with a new cultural project. At first, their conversations were professional. Then they began discussing the past, the choices each of them had made, and the lives they might have lived. Julian had always represented movement to her. I represented permanence. She did not say it cruelly. She spoke as though both qualities had value, and she had simply become uncertain which one belonged to her. She said the engagement had made everything feel final. The wedding date, the house we had begun viewing, the possibility of children, the joint savings plan. None of those things had frightened her individually. Together, they had felt like a corridor narrowing in front of her. I asked why she had said yes when I proposed. She said because she loved me. I asked why she had signed a 6-month lease with another man. She said, because she was afraid love had become the reason she was no longer making choices. The sentence hurt more than the lease. It suggested that the life we had built had not merely failed to make her happy. It had deprived her of the ability to recognize her own decisions. I asked whether she had intended to leave Monday. She said yes. I asked whether she had intended to tell me tonight. She looked down at her hands. Then she said yes again. I asked whether she planned to tell me before or after the guests left. After. She said the party mattered to her parents. Her father had been excited about it for months. People had already purchased tickets and hotel rooms. She believed canceling would turn her uncertainty into a public event. I told her the engagement itself was already a public event. The party was only its celebration. She said she knew that now. I asked what she had expected me to do after she told me. She did not answer immediately. Finally, she said she thought I would ask her to stay. I asked whether she wanted me to. She closed her eyes. She said part of her did. That answer contained the shape of the entire problem. Mara did not only want freedom. She wanted me to oppose it strongly enough that she could experience leaving as something taken, rather than something chosen. If I begged her to stay, the decision would become mine. If I became angry, Julian would become an escape. If I forgave her immediately, she could postpone understanding what she had done. I had loved her too long to participate in that confusion. I placed the seating plan on the table, with the blank side facing upward. Mara looked at the 4 facts and the line beneath them. She asked what it was. I said, it was what I knew before making my decision. Her eyes moved across the handwriting. She asked what decision. I told her our engagement was over. She leaned back as though the chair had moved beneath her. She said I had not even asked her to cancel the trip. I said no. She asked whether 5 years meant so little that I could end everything in one afternoon. I felt the first edge of anger then. It was not loud. It appeared as heat behind my eyes and tension in my jaw. I waited until it passed. Then I told her 5 years were the reason I would not spend another 6 months waiting to be selected. Mara's face changed. She began crying without sound. Tears gathered along her lower eyelids and moved slowly down her cheeks. She reached for a napkin from a nearby place setting and held it beneath one eye. I wanted to comfort her. That was perhaps the hardest part of the afternoon. My body still recognized her distress as something I should move toward. I knew the exact place between her shoulders where she carried tension. I knew she disliked being touched on the face while crying. I knew she would become cold in approximately 10 minutes. Love does not always withdraw when trust does. Sometimes it remains in the room with nowhere useful to go. Mara said she had not wanted to lose me. I told her that was not the same as choosing to stay. She said she had been confused. I said confusion could explain secrecy, but it could not make the secrecy harmless. She asked whether I believed people were allowed to be uncertain before marriage. I said yes. She asked why I was punishing her for it. I told her I was not punishing her. She had arranged a home in another city, purchased a one-way ticket, and decided when I would be allowed to learn about it. Those were not private feelings. They were decisions. She looked around the empty glass house. She said canceling the party felt like punishment. I said holding it would have required me to stand beside her while our families celebrated a promise she had already suspended. I could not do that. She asked what I had told everyone. I said nothing yet. She looked up quickly. I explained that I wanted to speak with her first. The message would say only that the engagement had ended and the party was cancelled. No reason. No mention of Julian. No photographs of the lease. No account of the messages. Mara asked whether I had read all of them. I said I read enough. She covered her face with both hands. For a while, neither of us spoke. The suspended lights above us were not yet switched on. In the gray afternoon, the small bulbs resembled drops of clear glass hanging from black cables. At 4:17, Mara lowered her hands. She asked what would happen to the apartment. The apartment had been mine before she moved in. Her name was not on the title, but she had contributed to household expenses and paid for much of the furniture. I told her she could remain there until she left Monday. I would stay elsewhere. Anything she had purchased was hers to take. Anything we had purchased together could be discussed later through email. Our joint household account would remain open for 30 days, so outstanding bills could clear. After that, the remaining balance would be divided equally. The wedding savings account contained mostly my money because Mara had been paying down student loans. I told her I would return every contribution she had made, including interest. She stared at me while I explained this. She asked how long I had been planning it. I said since that morning. She said it sounded as though I had been preparing for months. I told her my work had taught me what to do when a system could no longer be trusted. First, remove it from service. Then document what belongs to whom. Then prevent further damage. She gave a brief, broken laugh and said I was inspecting our relationship like an elevator. I said no. An elevator could be repaired without asking whether it wanted to carry you. Mara looked toward the windows. The rain was beginning to clear over the harbor. A pale strip of light had appeared between the clouds and the water. She asked whether I still loved her. There are questions that seem simple only because the truthful answer creates several more. I said yes. She began crying again. I told her loving her did not require me to remain engaged to someone who had planned her departure in secret. She said she might decide not to go. I asked whether she was saying she wanted to stay. She did not answer. Instead, she said she had not expected me to make the decision so final. I looked at the ring on her hand. Then I understood something that had been hidden beneath almost everything she had said. Mara had expected to leave while keeping the engagement intact. The trip was supposed to be a pause. I would remain in Harrowfield, still committed, still available, still carrying the future we had planned. She would spend 6 months deciding whether she wanted it. She had not expected freedom to include the possibility that I would no longer be waiting when she returned. I told her I would not reserve my life while she tested another one. She said Julian was not another life. I said the lease had both their names on it. She stopped arguing. At 4:31, I sent the message to the guests. My phone began vibrating almost immediately. I turned it off. Mara watched me place it inside my jacket pocket. She said her mother would call. I said I expected so. She asked whether she could tell her parents herself. I said yes. She asked whether I would come with her. I said no. Her face tightened. She said she could not do it alone. I reminded her that she had planned to tell me alone after the party. The words sounded harsher aloud than they had in my mind. I regretted them as soon as I spoke. I told her I was sorry. She nodded. I said I would not lie to her parents, but I would not volunteer details. If she wanted to explain what happened, that was her responsibility. Mara took a long breath. Then she slid the ring from her finger. The skin beneath it was paler than the rest of her hand. She placed it on the table between us. I opened the walnut box and set it beside the ring. She did not put it inside. Neither did I. For almost a minute, the ring remained on the glass, blue stone facing upward, surrounded by the reflected ceiling. Mara said she had imagined wearing it in Port Meridian. I asked why. She said because she did not want Julian to believe the trip meant more than it did. The answer was so strange and so honest that I could not immediately respond. She had wanted to wear my promise while exploring whether she preferred a life with someone else. Perhaps the ring made her feel anchored. Perhaps it allowed her to treat the trip as an exception rather than a departure. I placed the ring inside the box. The lid closed with a soft click. Mara flinched. She asked whether there was anything she could say that would change my mind. I told her not that afternoon. She asked whether there might be later. I said I did not know. That was the only answer I could give without lying. Celine approached from the service corridor at 4:46. She stopped several feet away and asked whether we needed more time. Mara looked at the untouched tables. Then she asked what would happen to the flowers. I told her they were going to 2 care homes. She nodded. She said that was good. We walked toward the elevator together. Celine remained behind, giving instructions to the staff in a quiet voice. One by one, they began removing glasses from the tables. At the elevator, Mara pressed the call button. The illuminated circle appeared around it. We stood beside each other without touching. She asked where I would go. I said to Nina's guest room for the weekend. After that, I would decide. The elevator arrived. The doors opened onto an empty car. Mara stepped inside, then turned toward me. She asked whether I was coming. I said no. She held the doors with one hand. Her eyes were red. A small section of hair had come loose near her left ear. She said she never wanted to hurt me. I told her I believed her. She asked why that did not seem to matter. I said, intentions mattered when deciding what someone deserved. They did not always determine what another person could continue living with. Her hand slipped from the door. The panels began moving together. Before they closed, she said she had only wanted space to understand herself. I told her she had it. The doors met between us. I remained at the glass house until 5:20. I helped Celine collect the place cards, menus, and printed photographs. The photographs had been intended for a display near the entrance. They showed Mara and me across 5 years, at a winter market, beside a lake, inside the kitchen after painting the cabinets green, on the observation platform where I proposed. I placed the photographs face down inside a cardboard box. Celine handed me the seating plans. There were 3 copies. I kept the one with my notes and placed the others in a recycling bin beneath the service counter. At 5:36, I walked out onto Alder Quay. The rain had stopped. Guests had begun replying to the cancellation message. Some expressed concern. Some asked whether there had been an accident. Mara's father called twice. My uncle sent a single line saying he was nearby if I needed him. I answered no one except Nina. She told me Mara had called her parents. She did not know what explanation Mara had given. Nina asked again whether she should come. This time I said yes. She met me at a small restaurant near her apartment. I had not eaten since breakfast, though I felt no hunger. She ordered soup for both of us. For the first 10 minutes, we spoke about nothing important. The rain, traffic, the price of parking near the quay. Then she asked whether I wanted her opinion of Mara. I said no. She understood. She asked whether I wanted to talk about what happened. I said not yet. So we ate soup in silence. That night, I slept in Nina's guest room beneath a quilt our grandmother had made. At 1:08 in the morning, I woke because I thought I heard Mara moving through our apartment. It took several seconds to remember where I was. My phone contained 39 unread messages. One was from Mara. She wrote that she was sorry. She said I had been kinder than she deserved and colder than she believed I could be. She did not know which part hurt more. I did not reply. At 6:20 on Monday morning, her flight left Harrowfield. I knew because the itinerary remained attached to our shared travel account. I did not track the aircraft. I did not check whether both passengers boarded. At 7:03, Mara sent another message. She said the keys were on the kitchen counter. She had taken 2 suitcases, her work equipment, her clothes, and the books from the left side of the bedroom shelves. Everything else could wait. She ended by saying she hoped I would understand someday that she had needed freedom. I read the message while sitting inside my car, outside Venick Tower. The replacement sensor cable had been installed, and I was there to test the elevator before returning it to service. Bram met me in the machine room. We ran the car empty from the basement to the 31st floor 6 times. Then we loaded it with test weights and repeated the route. Every signal remained stable. At 9:42, I signed the approval form. The elevator doors opened at the lobby. Before I stepped out, I wrote a reply to Mara. I told her I did understand. That was why I had given it to her. Then I turned off the shared travel notifications. For the next month, our contact was limited to practical matters: furniture, insurance, utility bills, the refund from the photographer. Mara asked for the green armchair from the study, and the set of blue ceramic bowls we bought during a weekend in Arden Vale. I agreed. I kept the dining table because my father had built it. She collected the remainder of her belongings after returning briefly from Port Meridian 4 weeks later. I arranged to be at work while she came. When I returned, the apartment looked wider. Her coats were gone from the hallway. The bottles on her side of the bathroom shelf had disappeared. On the kitchen counter, she had left the spare key beside a folded piece of paper. The note contained only 6 words. I wish I had told you first. I placed it in the document folder with the lease. Not because I wanted to preserve evidence, because it was the first sentence in which she had named what had actually broken us. 2 months later, Julian left Port Meridian. I learned this from Mara, not through investigation. She emailed to say that the project had lost funding, and Julian had accepted another position overseas. He asked her to go with him. She declined. She wrote that living with him had not become the life she imagined. I read the email once. I did not feel satisfaction. A person discovering that one choice was wrong does not make the abandoned choice right again. Mara asked whether we could meet when she returned to Harrowfield. I waited 3 days before answering. Then I agreed to one conversation. We met at Copper Finch on a Thursday afternoon in November. The cafe had placed small paper stars in the windows for winter. Mara arrived early and sat at the same back table where I had drafted the cancellation message. Her hair was shorter. She looked thinner, though not dramatically so. She wore no ring. For a moment, seeing her felt like opening a door and finding the old apartment on the other side. My body remembered her before my mind could establish distance. She stood when I approached. We did not hug. Mara said she was glad I came. I said I had promised I would listen. She told me Port Meridian had been quiet after Julian left. The apartment on Lantern Street overlooked a narrow courtyard where someone practiced the trumpet every evening at 7. She spent weeks walking along the harbor and trying to understand why the freedom she had wanted felt so much like absence. She said she had been angry with me at first. I asked why. She said, because I had made leaving too easy. I looked at her. Mara lowered her eyes. She said she understood how that sounded. I told her I thought she had wanted me to make the choice difficult enough that she could blame me for whichever path she took. She nodded. She said that was probably true. Then she said she had expected love to look like resistance. I asked whether secrecy had been her way of testing it. She said she did not know. She apologized without defending herself, not only for leaving, but for arranging the timing so I would carry the public consequences, while she carried none. She said she had wanted the photographs, the dinner, and her father's happiness, before stepping away from the promise being celebrated. The clarity of the apology affected me more than tears would have. I told her I accepted it. Mara asked whether accepting the apology meant there was a possibility for us. I said forgiveness and return were different movements. She looked toward the window. Outside, a delivery cyclist waited at the traffic lights, while rain collected on the shoulders of his jacket. Mara asked whether I had missed her. I said every day for a long time. She asked whether I still did. I told her sometimes. That was also true. She reached across the table, but stopped before touching my hand. She said she had learned that freedom was not the absence of consequence. I told her consequence was not the same as punishment. She nodded. We sat there for another 40 minutes. We spoke about her father, Nina, the sale of some furniture, and the blue bowls she had taken to Port Meridian. She said one had broken during the move. When we stood to leave, Mara asked whether I kept the ring. I said yes. She asked what I planned to do with it. I said I had not decided. She smiled sadly and said the stone still reminded her of the night. I understood what she meant. Outside the cafe, we walked in opposite directions. Neither of us looked back. The following spring, I moved out of the apartment. There was nothing wrong with it. The rooms were quiet, the mortgage was manageable, and the morning light still entered the study in narrow bars. But the apartment had become a place where I noticed absence more than space. I sold it to a young couple expecting their first child. On the final morning, I emptied the study cabinet and found the document folder behind a stack of inspection manuals. Inside were the lease, Mara's 6-word note, and the seating plan from the glass house. I read the 4 facts I had written on the back. Below them was the line I had drawn that afternoon. I realized I had never written anything beneath it. The logistical part of my life had continued without needing to be recorded there. I carried the folder downstairs and placed the lease and the note in the recycling bin. I kept the seating plan, not because of the names printed on the front, because of the blank space beneath the line. My new apartment was on the 9th floor of a building overlooking the Southern Railway yards. It had one bedroom, plain white walls, and an elevator I had inspected 3 years earlier. On my first evening there, I unpacked only what I needed: a plate, a glass, 2 shirts, my father's lamp. The walnut ring box remained at the bottom of a sealed carton. At 6:30, the time our engagement party had once been scheduled to begin, I carried the empty cartons to the recycling room. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed 9. As the car rose, the floor numbers illuminated one after another above the doors. The movement was steady. The cables made almost no sound. When the doors opened, evening light stretched across the corridor and through the open doorway of my apartment. I stepped out. Behind me, the doors closed without resistance.